This is the TAC Air game. I've always enjoyed this game because it represented the World War III basically in Germany around 1988, maybe 1990. And what I enjoyed about the game is it involved really the air defense guns and use of uh, helicopters and aircraft. Now, the aircraft, the tactical air support is really emphasized in this game, which I enjoyed. The NATO Air Force is very, very dominating. But then you counter that by tons of Soviet SAM sites. And then another thing this game really emphasizes is the rear echelon units as far as headquarters and supplies, and how much time, space is needed to get your headquarters and supply to support your combat units. And that really takes up a lot of time of your commanders and your generals in real war. Your logistics, that's all your generals are doing, is really moving troops around and playing logistics. And this game really emphasizes that. It's not just about the combat battalions. Now, with that being said, the combat between the fighting forces is kind of abstractly done. It's a differential combat table, but again, this game has never been intended to represent fighting between the combat levels, but the more emphasis is put on the tactical air support and what's going on in the air above the battleground, and how you can totally dominate the battlefield by destroying the rear echelon units. Some house rules, because the Soviets, I believe, just have a hard time winning the game because of the US air units. And so I like to throw in these house rules or any variation of them. First of all, Russia gets to pick the month to attack, and that's pretty basic. I think the Russians are going to be the aggressors, and they'll decide when they're going to invade. So they get to pick the month. The Russians, there's these counters that came in the general magazine, and they get to add 3 Su-27s. They add 3 MiG-23s. They add 1 Su-24 for an electronic control aircraft, because I'm sure by 1990 the Russians would be using that. And they add these to their Air Force without removing any other aircraft. So they're actually getting more aircraft on their side. So they're going to get 7 aircraft for that. And then they also are going to add 4 additional MiG-23s, which are specifically have to be used as wild weasels, because the Russians would also were entertaining the weasels in production. So they get to add that. So that's 11 aircraft are going to be added. Then they can use up to 2 other MiG-23s that they already have in their stock for wild weasels. So the total the Russians can use as wild weasels any one turn would be 6. Or you just specify certain aircraft that are going to be used as wild weasels, but no more than 6 are the Russians allowed to have. And then they add 1 drone. So they get to add this, 12 aircraft without losing any others. Third, the Russians will always go first. At the end of the day, we're not going to roll for switching initiatives. That's too killer. But again, that can be up for question. That can be debated. Another rule I like is anytime any side uses the NBC weapons, you lose victory points, because I don't agree just the first side, because no matter what, the Americans aren't going to be able to sit there at the negotiation table and say, oh, well, they fired nukes first, and then, sorry we devastated your countryside, but they started it. I don't think that would ever fly. If you're going to use nukes on the battlefield, both sides are going to get deducted for it. So every time you use it, you get deducted. Then the U.S. can add extra planes, but removes the older models as directed in the general magazine, except that they can keep 4 A-10s on the board. Okay, NATO does not get the Canadian Brigade. And then when a brigade loses its fighting battalions, you must remove all headquarters and supply units off the board. The reason I do that because when I'm Americans and you got your fighting battalions up there and you start losing them, you got one left or none left. Well, there's two supply units, there's headquarters, and I just throw those in the way of the Soviet units to block them. Now, because the combat in this game is so abstract that normally Russian T-80 battalion would just overrun the supplier headquarters units. It would barely slow them down. But in this game, you can actually block them, and they have to stop and maybe take a turn or two, 3 to 6 hours to blast through it. I just don't agree with it. So all headquarters and supplies are removed when the fighting portions of that regiment are destroyed, and the AA units are part of the fighting units, so they have to be gone also. And then the last thing is the artillery. The phasing side announces its indirect fire. Then the non-phasing side announces indirect fire or counter battery on the phasing artillery. But then IAD rolls in, but then you can go back to the phasing side and it can announce any counter battery on the non-phasing side. Then the non-phasing side can come back and announce counter battery on the phasing side, and this can go back and forth until all artillery batteries are accounted for or being used. And this way both sides are countering each other's artillery simultaneously. Otherwise, the first side gets an advantage in this. So that rule will actually helps benefits the Americans a little bit. So anyways, those are the house rules. With that being said, I will discuss the strategy. Now the NATO forces are set up sporadic, or most of the NATO forces are just have alert units up on the front, and the rest are at their bases. So they're starting more in the rear, and you have to get them up to the line. The dangerous Hawk systems are these white units. They're able to set up all over the place. And now one of the rules in the game is the Soviets come in from the northeast side. So I like to set up Hawks to watch the east side of the board mostly, because the Soviet airplanes just come in right there and can attack and damage ground units real easy. With that being said, most of the game, if I'm the Russians, the important stuff gets fought on the eastern side of the board, because that's where the Russian air units can be most effective. Where the NATO side comes in on the south and the west. So it's this side of the board that the Russians come in on. Now the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment is your only fighting unit that can set up on a forward base. And this is a very powerful force, and I like to set them up as far as they can go up there and make the Russians fight through them. And you can see how I get them set up. I leave little gaps between them, enough for zone of control. And the zone of control you can read about. That means the 6 hexes surrounding your fighting battalions are considered to be dangerous and engagement areas, so you can't just walk by them real quick. So if you set up the Armored Cavalry Regiment with that in mind, you can really cover a large area, as you see here. And if you set the units on the roads, it can be very effective too, because a Russian player that wants to start off with tactical nukes and blows those units out of the way because they're very strong, then he's damaging the road, and he blocks the road for himself, because the roads in this game are very important. You can use strategic movement and move up to 3 times the amount of your movement if the roads are wide open. So to me, blocking the roads is very key. And then of course you support your Armored Cavalry Regiment with these. Of course, in this game, you forward air controllers or any Armored Cavalry unit, helicopters, or headquarters. And the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment is all reconnaissance, so they can call in airstrikes. So no matter if the entire 51st Tank Division comes at them, the first turn they can just bring on maximum aircraft and just rain bombs on the tank unit. So it's a very powerful unit, and that's why I set it up in a forward defensive base up here. Now, with that being said, an important city for the NATO is Beirut here on the eastern side of the board, and another one called Kalmuk, which is north of Beirut. And the Soviets would do well to come in and take Kalmuk here to control their flanks and to move into Beirut, because victory conditions state if you can move off to the south of Beirut, then you get points. Now, that's kind of a catch-22, because if you're going to move your fighting units off the board, if you're pushing real hard to get 4 or 5 combat units, they have to be combat units off the edge of the board, it gives you 4 or 5 points, but now you're lacking those units to actually fight the Americans that are still left on the board. So you only move off when you feel you've totally defeated the Americans, and you can move off, a few brigades or maybe a division. And anyways, and then this is another area that I really like the Soviets to come into, because there's not a lot of woods. It's a nice little plains valley area that you can come across the river at Kalmuk and advance right through it, and NATO doesn't get a lot of defensive help there by the woods. So I really like coming through Kalmuk, and why I'm trying to surround Beirut. Okay, with that being said, let's move to the NATO strategy, because it's pretty simple. With NATO, they start with most of their assets we've already discussed, and they start with a couple brigades of the 3rd Mechanized Division over here. So what I like to do is send these units as quick as possible up to the northern river line and over here to help protect the flank of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment when the Russians try to come around. So the entire main river gets defended by the 3rd Mechanized units, backed up by all the divisional and corps assets. You can see how they're lined out here where the river is. And right here we'll hone in on this bridge that I destroyed, because one important thing I want to touch in is, like, you can see this bridge has been blown up. It has a white little X counter. It's covered by the NATO unit, but it's blown. I like to blow bridges no matter what side I'm on, because for the Russians, if they have to stop and it's difficult to get over a river, then they're very vulnerable. And helicopters in this game come in very handy. I flew them right to this area where it was vulnerable, where the Russians could try to break through an area, and I put the helicopters there. So you just defend behind this river. Now, one brigade has to come in way over here in the northwest side of the board, and that's unfortunate, but you do what you can. It comes in and it tries to just harass whatever it can on the flank of the Soviet Central Group forces and do whatever it can. So while the 3rd is tasked with holding the river, the 2nd Armored Cavalry is tasked with holding off any Russian units making to Beirut until the German divisions come in to help out over there. So that's 4 turns. Meanwhile, the 1st Armored Division is tasked with smashing into the flank of the entire Central Group forces, and wherever that is and wherever that may be, he is to go on the offensive and move into the flank of the Russian forces, and it's usually coming from the west side of the board. So what you end up with is these 2 1st Armored Division tank brigades and a German tank brigade and a mechanized brigade coming in from and smashing the flank. It gives us the offensive mobility we're looking for as the Americans. So while you're defending on the east side, the western side, we are advancing and attacking with air support and everything we have as far as the 1st Armored Division goes and the mechanized division. Now on turn 1, there is one 1st Armored 2nd Brigade that enters on the south edge of the board, and you're very tempted to send that into a defensive type position against the 51st, but I do not. Let the 3rd handle it, and send that 1st up through Bamberg and into the flank with the rest of the 1st Armored Division. And I think that tank division will be able to hammer anything the Russians can throw at it. Now the Russian strategy, basically I have three depending on what I see the American 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment set up as. If they have a forward defense like this, I got a couple choices. I either take the 51st and I just hit them. And what I like to do is use a nuke right away, because I can't be bogged down fighting a couple battalions defensive units in the woods here. So I just blow a nuke on one of them to open up the zone of control and move on through them. And with that being done, I will normally take the 51st and take it on a suicide mission all the way into Beirut. Now while they're doing that, the 6th Guards Division, my best and strongest, comes down and feints an attack straight over the river to pull as many NATO forces as I can up that way. And then, while the 51st is punching in to Beirut and basically wasting everything they have, the 6th will start moving in behind it. And this we call like the linebacker. Okay, 51st wastes its units destroying everything it can, and the 6th moves in behind it, while the 18th is over here protecting the flank and the rear of the 6th. So basically, the 51st takes all the damage, the 18th will take the brunt of the damage, and the 6th is used to punch a hole right through Beirut and off the board. Now my next strategy is sort of the pick and roll, we call it. That's where the 51st comes in way at the corner. You see it up here? It has a couple of advantages. One, you don't have to start with the nuke strike clearing out the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment that's positioned up here in a forward base. And two, with the forward Armored Cavalry being able to call in airstrikes, the division's so far away that it kind of will waste hopefully a lot of its aircraft. But at the same time, I will bring in one brigade just to harass the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment and keep it honest. You can see as it comes in, there were some disruptions put on it because aircraft did fly. But for the most part, the 51st heads down, goes way around the mountains up here, and heads to Kalmuk. It heads to that area that I like on the board, right above Kalmuk, to get across the river where it's wide open. As the 51st makes the pick right into that area and engages NATO units there, the 6th comes up behind it again, feinting a strong advance with the 18th on its flank to the west side of the board, and then we swing the 6th around into the area of Beirut again. Now, we don't do that until the 51st gets its whole division over Kalmuk and start hitting into the NATO unit. You can see it'll take a while. It'll take the whole first day. So not until the second day is the 6th really starting to come around behind it. Now, the advantage to this is we stay way north, which gives us the advantage with our aircraft, and his Hawk systems hopefully are farther down south. So that's an advantage. But it does give NATO time to get its German divisions and all its units on the board to combat us. But this is more of, I'm not really trying to get off the edge of the board. I'm just going to fight NATO, but fight them more in the northern half of the board. So the pick and roll is something I like. It's a lot of maneuvering. And again, the 18th is over here protecting the flank of the 6th, while the 6th completes its maneuver around to the east side behind the 51st Division. So that's how that one works, and I'll show you some pictures of what it eventually looks like. And before we get to the pictures of the pick and roll, remember the Soviets can have up to 6 Wild Weasels, and they have 1 electronic aircraft without losing their Su-24 bomber ability. So you really concentrate on getting rid of the Hawk systems with the Wild Weasels. Every turn you should be going after the Hawks, especially on the eastern side of the board, because toward the end of the game you're going to be over there and you want those Hawks gone. Now as the 6 swings around here, the timing that the 51st crosses it and the 6 goes behind it has to be timed perfectly, because I want the Germans to feel they can smash into our flank of the 51st there, but the 6 is all going to be in position on the roads and stuff to head down like they're coming to Beirut, but I'm going to stop short. That's because I want the Germans to come up after me, and that way I can fight more on the northern side of the board, and I'll drop nukes on them as soon as they get right past Beirut. So we want the fighting to stay up more toward the northern side. And again, the 18th is always tasked with protecting the flank and the rear of the 6th Guards Tank Division. And they're a good defensive unit. So let's look at some shots of what the game should look like after the first day, toward the end of the first day, and heading into the second. Well, this is 24 hours into the battle. We're fighting in the northeastern side of the board. This is the pick and roll. It's where we're going to hammer it out. Now you can see the 51st has made it across the river. Remember, they came in all the way from the northeast, traveled the high road around Kamalk and engaged there. The 6th is engaged with the German units in this area. Remember, not down by Beirut. They're taking a pounding by the air. But anyways, the area all back here is where SAMs are fully covering our units. We chose to drop our airborne unit southwest of Beirut. It was an open area, and I can get in behind the German units and start getting their support units done. Likewise, the West German airborne brigade is flying up the east side of the board right there, and it's going to move in on the east side of the 6th Tank Division in a nice wooded area right here and harass the Russians. Now you can see the 18th is getting hit. Now this is part of the NATO strategy. Remember, the 3rd Mechanized is doing all the defensive work behind the main river and around Beirut. The 1st Armored Division is smashing into the right flank of the Soviet forces. You see this whole armored unit here? It is attacking. Now the Soviets are doing a strategic withdrawal because the 18th cannot stand the onslaught, so they are defending, moving back, defending, moving back as the gaps open up. And the 1st Armored Division is hitting there hard. Now let's move ahead another day. We'll show you what the board looks like. Now this is the end of the second day. You can see it's not so much a U anymore, but we're moving more in a diagonal direction. You can see on this side that the 6th Guards Tank Division pushed the Germans all the way back almost to Beirut, and the Soviet Airborne was really wrecking havoc in the rear. So I had to bring up the German airborne unit. Did not fly up to the woods like I wanted. I had to bring them in Beirut to help defend that area. You can see here the 51st that was making their way over the river really got stopped by the 3rd. It's just heavy fighting around here. They can't advance any further. The whole second day they've been fighting it out. And the 18th is slowly getting pushed back. You can see the German units up there taking the flank. They are getting pushed and they're withdrawing back. Now this is part of going into the 3rd day. The Americans actually dropped a nuke up there in East Germany, really wiping out a section of units right there, and the Germans and Americans are going to push through right here. However, the Russians are allowed to reform 4 brigades, and they reformed one to bring it back on behind that unit. So this game goes back and forth. But this is the end. We are heading on to the 4th day, and I'm going to say it looks like the Russians, it's going to be a close game, but it looks like they're pushing south here. The strategy's working. I'm pushing beyond this border, but the 1st Armored Division is pushing back the 18th Guards way in the north. But the fighting is getting done on the northeast side of the board, where it favors my Air Force, and that's what we wanted. This is it for part 1. Part 2 is going to be an actual gameplay against an opponent. He's a new kid and he's younger, but he's learning, and he's going to take NATO. And based on his strategy, we'll see if I conduct the linebacker or the pick and roll, or another strategy. We'll see.